I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. We're here today to have a conversation about politics and policy with the Speaker of the Texas House of Representatives, the Honorable Joe Straus of San Antonio. So, welcome, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for coming back to campus again.
Thank you, Jim. Good to be back with you again.
So, how was your week?
Well, my week was okay. Better than Paul Ryan's so far. And it will only get better when I go to San Antonio this afternoon. But we've reached the halfway point in our session, and things are beginning to move along more rapidly, as you would expect. The second half of the session is when the cavalry, breaks loose. And I feel good about the progress we're making on the issues that we need to be addressing this session. So generally, had a good week.
So let's talk a little bit then about the core issue, really. I mean, when we've spoken before, you recognize, like everyone else does, that the one thing you have to do is the budget. And it does seem like you and the Senate are still not exactly on the same page on the budget. So, the cliche here is that budgets are about choices. What are the choices the House is making on the budget right now?
Well, you're exactly right. There is only one bill that the Constitution says we must pass, and that is a balanced budget. Former Lieutenant Governor Hobby one time said that the balanced budget is the only thing you must do, and he called everything else poetry. But the budget is a document of priorities, and in the House, those priorities are public education, higher education. We've made a special significant effort to address mental health care, CPS reforms, and more funding. And so we're trying to work into that budget document in a very difficult budget year, by the way, with a significant shortfall. We're trying to do a good job of making cuts. We're going to be spending less money in the budget we're working on today than the budget we're living under today. So with budget cuts and some other options available to us, we're going to try to limit some of the budget cutting and try to do the prudent, smart things, still making investments in these key areas that are important to the future economic growth and potential of Texas.
But there's inevitably going to be some cuts.
There will be cuts. There are cuts in the current budget that we're working on. And we have several options going forward. We can cut more deeply. We can use some of these other tools that are available to cushion the blow. And I know the House feels very strongly that higher education, for example, since I'm sitting here at a large university, but our community colleges and our universities across the state of Texas are going to have some budget cuts from us, but we want to limit the damage that's done by that.
You've mentioned indirectly the different options, and that is one of the big points of contention right now is whether you go into the rainy day fund, and if so, how much. I mean, I think there's two branches there. Make the case for going into the rainy day fund rather than the approach that's been taken in the Senate, it would seem, at least so far, that you were pretty critical of earlier this week.
I was very critical of it, and not because they wanted to defer a payment. I mean, we've done that in the past. It's pretty well accepted as an option you can use. Now, you have to be careful with it and not defer too much or too many areas, because it's a bit of to borrow the old phrase from Senator Howard Baker, it's a bit of a riverboat gamble, because you have to come back and make up that money. And I'm not convinced that the economy 2 years from now is going to be so strong that we can just be casual about how much and how far we defer payments. But what I was really critical about in the Senate's approach wasn't that they were deferring a payment, but they were deferring and spending the same dollars. And that is not something the House is going to do. I came to this truth and budgeting fixation pretty naturally. When I was a freshman member of the Texas House, I was convinced by leadership at that time to vote for the continuation of a tax that supported a program that no longer existed. And once the votes were made and the budget was passed, I went back and thought long and hard about what we had just done, and committed myself to not doing that again. So the very next session, 2007, I carried the bill to abolish a tax because the revenue was no longer supporting, there was no longer a program there that tax was dedicated to, so-called dedicated to. And over the years, the past 4 years, the House has done a very good job leading on transparency in our budget, using dedicated taxes and fees for their intended purpose, for example. And there's lots of examples of that. Ending the diversions of the gasoline tax, for one. Using the sporting goods tax more for parks now. Trauma care funds, and on. And we've not crossed some of these lines, and we're not going to.
So then what makes put it this way, the rainy day fund, the argument is typically that this should be used for one time that it's raining, for one-time expenses.
Well,
do you accept that or not? And is that what's going on here? Or?
You can create whatever, you can move the goalpost wherever you want to place it. And that's what's happened. Because in the past, Republican leadership has used the rainy day fund when they've needed to. And all these contrivances today that dictate when you can and can't use it, it's fine. You can sort of make it up randomly. And that seems to be what's happened.
So why the resistance? Well, so why the resistance this time? Is it something in the water? Is it? I mean, what's going on?
I can only guess. Like many other these false definitions come out of some big donors think tank or something.
So you think it's really this is about political forces that are using these ideas.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to say that you can double count a deferral and spending, and that's okay, but using a modest amount of your savings is not, is a debate we're going to have later. And it's early. I mean, we'll work these things out. This isn't the first time the House and the Senate have had differences of opinions on budgeting, and we'll get to a good answer, I think.
I want to ask you one more I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but one of the things that we see in polling, particularly among Republicans, but has also been a theme in the legislature, has been property tax reduction and the way that that's going to impact the budget and how to do that. It does seem like an area where the House and the Senate are actually not too far apart in terms of the rollback bills being sponsored by Senator Betancourt, Representative Bonin. Is that something you think is going to happen?
Well, I think that may be, but let me go back to the beginning of your question, and you made a comment about property tax reduction. The legislature is very unlikely to reduce people's property taxes unless we make progress in school finance reform and have more state dollars into our local schools and alleviating some of the burdens of the local school districts and the property taxpayers there. But on the bills that Betancourt and Chairman Bonin have, I think they're working pretty closely together on some reforms, largely in the area of transparency, giving local taxpayers a lot more information about how their taxes are calculated and what's really being done to them, and some more accountability measures on local officials. Chairman Bonin's a real pro. He knows what he's doing, and I'm sure as he rolls out his bill and works on it, he'll have something very positive to present to the House.
That leads us naturally to public education, which you said was one of your major priorities, or priority of the House this time. What are you trying to accomplish in public education this time?
Well, we're trying to accomplish what has been long neglected, which is necessary reforms in school funding. The Robin Hood recapture system is badly out of control. It's getting worse. It's now beginning to apply itself to some of the larger school districts in Texas that nobody would consider to be property rich or wealthy school districts. When Robin Hood began decades ago, it included school districts like the one I live in, which was a fairly limited answer to the problem at the time. But over time, it's grown to hundreds of districts that originally couldn't have been ever fathomed to be in the recapture system. So Chairman Huberty has a bill that would positively impact about 95% of our school districts, getting more money into the classrooms and beginning to address the out-of-control Robin Hood system. I think it's $350 million, which is a good start in a constrained, tight budget year. So my hat's off to him. I think the House is going to support him on that. And what's really amazing and remarkable would be that we could do this without a judge holding a gun to our heads, which is always in the past what it's taken. So it's a real determined commitment, and I hope that we can accomplish that goal.
Chairman Huberty said this was probably the beginning of something that would take, I think his phrase was a couple of 3 sessions. Does that make sense to you? That
Yeah, I think it's a good, strong step in the right direction. I don't think that we can correct a system that's been neglected for many, many years all in one step, especially a session like this one when we're trying to close a budget gap and we're very constrained on our spending.
So finances are one constraint. Another constraint, as always, is politics. Going back as far as the fall, I did a panel with several House members and several Senate members at the Texas Tribune Festival in the fall. I was really struck at the time by how much interest there was in approaching school finance in the House and how little interest there was in approaching it in the Senate. Obviously, the talk around the Capitol is always the metaphor right now of hostage taking, that you can't really get you can't really get a school finance bill without some kind of a voucher bill. Now, Chairman Huberty, who is his own person but was appointed by you, has been pretty unambiguous in saying this thing is dead on arrival in the House. Is that going to scuttle the whole deal?
Well, I don't know. I hope not. But terms like hostage taking and all these terms that describe our work over there doesn't sound like a very nice place to work, does it? But
well, again, by comparison,
it's really not that bad.
You could be trying to reform the Affordable Care Act.
It's true. Thankfully, not. I think we'll be able to resolve most of our differences. I don't think that all of these things are zero-sum games. That if you're not for this, then I can't support you on that. It's sort of arbitrary to tie them together, and I hope that's not what's happening, because I think Chairman Huberty was correct. He used a little stronger language than I would have probably, and I think he's going to give Senator Taylor, who's a really good guy, former member of the House. He was our Republican caucus chairman. We like him a lot. I'm sure he'll have the courtesy of a hearing, but I think Chairman Huberty was correct. If the past is still if the past reception to this type of bill is still status quo today, it probably won't be met with great enthusiasm in the House.
And there's not much to be done about that. You're not going to do extra, obviously. Given where you are on this,
No,
I think.
The members ought to vote their districts, and if you're a member from rural West Texas and your district is telling you, look the other way, don't run away, don't vote for this, that's what I expect them to do. Don't vote for it. I know there's a lot of passion on that issue, but there's some good things happening in school choice too. I had a meeting the other day with the superintendent of the San Antonio Independent School District. He brought in some leaders from the high-quality charter schools. They're working together in some innovative ways. So there's a lot happening on the positive side. It isn't all about that bill's dead, that bill's dead. There's some good things happening too, and some positive things I think we'll be able to be real pleased with at the end of the session.
Can you is there a way to tie the property tax issue to school finance in a productive way that might enable you to sidestep that?
Well, they are connected.
Well, legislatively, not.
Yeah, I don't know, but they are connected, and the more the state does for local school property taxpayers, the less the local school districts have to assess to their citizens. So they are tied together, and I think the state has an obligation to do more and to do better than we have in the past. And when property values go up, typically what we've seen lately is the state looks the other way and says, well, gosh, isn't that nice? That helps us.
Right. You mentioned higher ed before we move too far out of education as an issue. There's been obviously lots of talk about higher ed, and again, different views towards this from a budgetary perspective in the Senate and in the House. What do you think about the discussion of revisiting the issue of tuition and who has a say over tuition levels and, so-called, I mean, the simple way is to call it regulation versus deregulation. Obviously, the bills that are circulating now in both chambers situate themselves in different places. Is that where we ought to be looking?
Well, speaking for myself and not the other House members, I've not been a big proponent of tuition regulation at the legislative level, particularly in a year when we're going to be cutting our contributions and our appropriations to higher education. And I still believe that, for instance, the education you receive on the campus we're sitting in today is a pretty good bargain. And the supply and demand out there seems to be working. There are an awful lot of people applying to go to school here who haven't been priced out of it yet. Now, I want to be sensitive to rising costs, and I'm not downplaying the burdens of the cost of higher education on our young people and their families. But whether the legislature ought to be imposing really strict regulations on it, I have a bit of a problem with that, as I said, particularly in years when we're also cutting their funding.
Seems to be making the problem worse rather than better. From that perspective, of course, I'm a little interested. Also in the higher ed space, before we move on, I was at a very wrenching hearing yesterday in the Senate on sexual assault on college campuses. Is the House going to probably get involved in that issue as well?
Yes, I think we will. We had an interim report done on this horrible situation. And I know that there are bills in the House and the Senate that we'll get together on and hopefully help campus officials, who I believe are responsible in wanting to address this too. We can work with them to help do something about this. It's shocking, and it's not acceptable. And I'm glad it's getting the attention that it has long deserved.
I want to kind of run through a few other issues, but we were talking before the recording. You were asking who's here. When we had the comptroller here not too long ago, I asked the comptroller, it seems to me like there are lots of issues in the air right now that are really focused on this axis between state government and local governments. Earlier this week, Governor Abbott called for kind of a vaguely worded but still kind of definite in its intent, more sweeping authority to be given to state government to intervene decisively against what's going on at the local level. And he wasn't particularly specific about it. When I mentioned to the comptroller, he was kind of like, this stuff's always going on. But it does seem like since I talked to him in November and now, there's a lot more of it going on. Am I wrong about that? I mean,
no, I think you're right. But I think the comptroller was right too. It's always going on.
That's good.
And and I expect it will continue to go on. And I don't know exactly what the governor said. I personally take these issues one at a time and think that would be the wisest way to approach it. In the last session, the most significant issue along these lines was the fracking ban issue. And Chairman Darby did an outstanding job bringing stakeholders together and working with municipalities as well and negotiating something that I thought was thoughtful and good for the Texas economy. So take them step by step, think them through. I don't think a blanket policy on exerting, power from Austin over locals is a particularly attractive idea, and I don't think it'll happen.
Okay, well, one area that does seem to be moving is in the notion of so-called sanctuary cities. And for a long time, I've kind of felt that was more a term of art than precision. But right now, the notion of sanctuary cities seems to revolve around requiring municipal governments to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Where do you think the House is going to come down on? That's frankly a tough issue, I think, for Republicans, given what we know about polling on illegal immigration and border security among Republican primary voters.
Right, and again, and I've been saying this for years, and it hasn't changed, even though the politics have changed, or the politicians, majorities have changed in Washington, but the inability to address immigration reform in Washington has led to this year after year after year pressure in the states, especially the border states. I do believe that a that a sanctuary cities bill of some sort will pass. Chairman Guerin is leading the effort in the Texas House. Had a hearing a week or so ago, and I know he's working hard on a bill that he thinks will be a good bill. I know he's sensitive to law enforcement, some of the concerns that they have. We want to make sure, and I know Chairman Guerin wants to make sure that our citizens are not inhibited from working with their local police officers. And so we're going to come up with something that's thoughtful, that works, and that addresses the concerns that people have.
And part of that is both citizens and non-citizens being willing to work with law enforcement, right?
Yeah, law enforcement has to do their job, and I know that we're going to try to be as in tune with their concerns as we can be.
Since we're talking about a local issue and the relationship between state regulations, this is probably the time, if ever, to talk about SB 6, I suppose. And
thanks.
The so-called bathroom bill. Yeah, I mean, I think I probably telegraphed that I knew it wasn't going to be what you really wanted to talk about. But that's also happening on this axis of conflict of trying to get the states involved in local authorities. You've said it's not a priority, and I know it's up to the will of the members. If you had to guess right now, and you would be a very educated guess on your part, do you think it would get to the floor of the House?
Well, I do guess, by the way. And I've even gone further than it's not a priority. I've said I oppose it. Predicting the path in the House is anybody's guess. Somewhat educated, I would say, that I don't feel a great deal of fervor to promote that bill in the House. I'm not saying that it wouldn't pass if it were pushed on them, the members, but we'll have to see. I know that I come from San Antonio. My constituents aren't talking about it, certainly not in a positive way. My community is going to be the one year from now that has the Final Four NCAA basketball championships, and we're pretty sensitive to sending the wrong signals to those that we want to attract. We've also done such a great job in Texas over the last decade or more of building this reputation as being outstanding business magnets. Job creators are flocking here. Our population's grown by, 500,000 a year or something. Tremendous growth. Job creating mecca, welcoming state. And to walk with our eyes wide open into a situation that North Carolina led on, I think being the second state after them, or the first state after them, I think would be a tremendous mistake. And it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of thousands of businesses who are those job creators. Politicians don't create jobs, but we can sure make some boo-boos that lead to some problems in job creation and in our economy, and I don't want to be party to doing that. And this issue, by the way, I never even heard about it until a year or two ago. I can't even recall how it came up, but for it to get this much attention in a legislative session is astounding to me.
Well, the proponents of this would say in part, and they were saying on the Senate floor, and it was a little anachronistic, I think, but we're saying it came up because the Obama administration pushed it. It feels a little like it's yesterday's problem in that regard.
It does to me, and I think, the Obama administration, I believe, is not there anymore, and the Trump administration has reversed whatever they did, I think. So we'll see where it goes, but count me as
no.
as a no, yeah.
Now you mentioned the business.
And by the way,
yeah.
We get to if we've gotten to the point in our civilization and our society that our politicians have to pass bills about bathroom stuff, we've gotten really out of control. There are laws on the books now about behavior in a bathroom or creating crimes, criminal acts in a bathroom or anywhere else. So it seems a little manufactured to me and unnecessary.
Now you mentioned that really the primary argument, or one of the primary arguments, is about the business climate, economic development based argument, and that lots of businesses are against this. Do you think that those businesses are mobilizing effectively? And I don't mean just, obviously Texas Association of Business had a rough time with that report that got kicked around. But writ large, do you think that the business community is stepping up and up on this? I mean, and I ask because I know that in a way you've asked them pretty publicly
I have.
to get more involved. And how are they doing? Because it seems like the only ads I'm seeing are from the other side.
Yeah, well, I've asked them publicly, I've asked them privately, and I think many of them are weighing in. The Dallas Chamber of Commerce, for example, has done a very effective job. Individual businesses. I met with a large financial services company unrelated to this issue a couple of weeks ago, and the person volunteered to me that one of their largest campuses where they bring clients in is in North Carolina. They also have a very large presence in North Texas. And he said, we are vocally opposed to this, and we've seen it hurt our business in North Carolina. We can't get a lot of clients to fly into our seminars and to our training programs anymore. So it's beyond just big league sports and to college athletics. It's real important job creators and businesses out there who are speaking up. The question is whether people are listening.
I mean, because public opinion is pretty soft on this, really, despite the discussion in some areas.
If where I come from is any guide at all, it just, no one mentions it. School districts I represent have never had a problem, and it's almost this sort of contrived thing. But we'll see where it goes.
This brings us not so obliquely to just the state of things in Austin right now.
Speaking of bathrooms.
Speaking of bathrooms, let's talk about the relationship between you and the governor and the lieutenant governor. You know, it's pretty hard to ignore the fact that there seems to be, to put it gently, not a lot of cooperation necessarily between you and the governor and the lieutenant governor. And I don't want to get too far in front of that. I want to ask you not just, do you guys like each other, but more, should we expect this? I mean, to some degree, I get in arguments with people a bit about saying, look, to some degree, you should just expect this. It's kind of baked into the system. On the other hand, it does seem like, on a week like this week where, there's kind of a lot of to and fro between people, and I know it's just signaling, but
yeah.
how much is this should we be expected? How much of it is a little off the line?
Well, I think some of it's natural. You're going to have some disagreements, and they're going to be the things that are, more amplified. I think the relationship between the three of us who have breakfast every Wednesday, and along with the comptroller, is pretty good. This is a tough session budgetarily, and that leads to, I think, an amplification of some of the differences that we might have. We will work together. The system was built for there to be some friction and some ways to work through it. They're very different institutions, the House and the Senate. We work on our priorities, the Senate works on theirs, the governor has his, and at the end of the day, we do as many of them as we can all work out, and I'm sure we will. But we're all mature adults, and we'll work it out.
Allowing for the fact that, all things being equal, of course, everybody would like the governor to come out all the time and agree with them.
Well, not necessarily.
Do you think the governor is involved enough at this point?
Well,
is it about what you would expect?
At this point, it really should be between the House and the Senate, and the House working its priorities, passing our bills, the Senate passing theirs, getting together and cooperating on House and Senate bills and priorities, and the governor can be helpful. But his main role really is to let us know what's important to him. And then after the session's over, he gets to decide which of those bills to sign, which ones not to.
You feel like you know what's important to him?
Well, he made it pretty clear in the State of the State. He made 3 or 4 or 5 things very clear.
We've talked a little bit beforehand, and it's come up. I want to, you are a lifelong Republican, to my knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah. What the hell do you make of what's going on nationally? Where is the Republican brand right now? I mean, do you have a clear sense of what your party is about right now at the national level, given Donald Trump's victory, given the path of the primaries?
That's a very good question. I think the Trump election was one that raises some question marks about where the party is headed. But we do have we do have a majority in the U.S. Senate. We have a majority in the Congress. We have a majority in the majority of states, maybe a supermajority of states, most of the governors by far. So, it would be a little bit of a stretch to say the Republican Party's in trouble. But just where it's going, not where it's been, but where it's going, is an open question. And a lot of that's playing out in Washington, some of it today.
As we speak. But, granted all that, I mean, I moved to ask, how do you feel about it? And maybe I'm just going to ask you that. I mean,
Well,
because,
I feel really pretty good having chaired the Republican Legislative Campaign Committee in this last cycle, when we already had almost a supermajority of majorities, and everybody said all you can do is go down, and we actually picked up some and did very, very well. So I feel pretty good about the political results. Now the real challenge is to deliver. And the next election is going to be a referendum on how we performed in office right now. And that's what's most important.
And how does it seem like it's going to you?
Well, I think in Texas it's going fairly well.
How about
It will.
How about nationally?
Well, today's a little rough up there in Washington on the healthcare thing, but that's a very complicated, difficult issue under the best of circumstances. So let's see, let's do a checkup in a few months and see how they're doing on more than just the one that nobody ever seems to get right.
I was thinking as I was getting ready for this, so this is the third time you've come here. I think, 11, 15, 17, you've been doing this job for a while.
Yeah.
How much more do you want to accomplish?
Well, I want to accomplish a lot this session, and a lot of it we talked about in the budget discussion. There's some priorities in mental health care and public school finance, and CPS reforms. I'm working on eliminating straight ticket voting with Representative Ron Simmons. That would be a big move. But in terms of, if you're asking, am I going to run again or am I tired of the job? No, I've been doing it a long time. The House has changed a lot since I've been there, and I feel pretty good about what we've accomplished along the way. And bringing along the newer members that have come in the last 2 or 3 cycles, a lot of them. I feel good about where we are. I think the members feel pretty good too. And I'm one that takes these things one session at a time.
I wouldn't ask you if you were going to run again. I mean, I'm enough of a student of history.
I'm not planning not to. There's no news here, but I enjoy the job. It's unbelievably challenging. And the part that I enjoy the most about it is the camaraderie in the House and those who genuinely feel a sense of doing good things for the state of Texas, and that's on both sides of the aisle, really. So things are, I think, going pretty well.
I think we're not going to do much better than that. I'm going to stop and open it up for questions here. While we're gathering up questions, are there questions in the audience? Don't be shy. I see a hand.
Wake up.
So it seems like Republicans in Congress are having trouble repealing the Affordable Care Act. If they can't repeal it, is it enough for Texas to have more flexibility to negotiate over Medicaid, for example, with a Republican in the White House? Or does the Affordable Care Act need to be repealed?
Well, I would be in favor of repealing it, but then you have the question of what replaces it. And if they fail in their attempt that's currently underway, I do feel, from what I'm told, and I've talked to Senator Cornyn about this recently, that those in the new administration should be friendly to Texas and work with us and maybe give us some more flexibility to continue the waivers that we've been living under and so forth in the last few years. So I don't think it's going to be a debacle if they don't accomplish their mission. Actually, if they do accomplish passing a bill up there, would be a lot more questions than answers. So we'll work our way through it. I think a Republican administration and great advocates like Senator Cornyn and Congressman Brady up there and others are going to work well with us.
Other questions? Josh?
I'm just wondering, with the property tax issue, it seems like this keeps coming up repeatedly. And I mean, it doesn't seem like there's much that you all in the legislature can really do to directly affect property taxes. I mean, is there ever any discussion or thoughts about, how the state runs its finances just from a broader perspective? I mean, I know that the general thing is there's going to be no new revenue, and we start from there. But if the concern is that, one of the state's main sources of revenue is attached to this thing that fluctuates in value, who's going to be taxed at varying rates over different points in time, by a bunch of different entities. I mean, isn't that just creating the problem for yourselves? And I guess, is there any other ways that Texas could approach this?
Well, the beginning of your question, I agree with. There isn't a whole lot we can do to effectuate changes in the local property tax. But we can shine a brighter light on those who do assess local property taxes and are in charge of policies in our communities. And I think sometimes, to a fault, politicians in Austin lead voters into believing that we are responsible for their local property taxes. And that is not I don't think that's a positive service to the voters to mislead them that way. Back to, Chairman Bonin's bill, I do think there are some improvements that we can provide for local property taxpayers to give them more information and to provide more transparency locally. And I think the real key to all of this, though, at the state level, the biggest impact of local property taxes is on schools. And again, I'll go back to saying how much of a priority it is for me to see that we make some progress in funding our schools in a way that helps local property taxpayers and can cushion some of the very high rates that they're having to pay today.
I want to follow up on Josh's question just a little bit. Another way, or maybe even embedded in Josh's question a little bit, is you've talked a lot about how much more modern the state has gotten, how much it's grown, the increasing demands. I mean, is there a point at which we do have to step back and begin to think structurally about how we fund services in the state, given what we know? I mean, it's a version of the Steve Murdoch talk that I'm sure you've seen, which is, if you look at the structural and demographic fundamentals in the state, we're gonna have a harder and harder time, dealing with that situation with the tools at hand.
Yes.
Is that too pessimistic? Or?
$100 oil sure helps.
Yeah.
And the absence of $100 oil is felt. So yeah, I mean, Texas is growing tremendously. I saw a report today that I think it was Comal, Kendall, and Hayes County were 3 of the top 10 growing counties in the United States. Texas is growing by about, I think, 500,000 people a year. We're up to close to 28 million or something in the state, and that growth will continue. So yes, I think it's inevitable that we're going to have to continue to see if changes need to be made. But we are heavily reliant on a sales tax, and we've got to do everything we can in the short term to make sure that we have people employed and capable of paying sales taxes,
I mean,
and owning property and contributing to the economy. That all comes back to education.
It does seem like some of those, like some of the inputs are rather limited, though, right?
Well, yeah.
And I don't mean quantitatively, but just the tools. There are just not many tools.
That's right.
And particularly in a political environment in which, no new revenue and no new taxes seems to be.
And we're trying to find a pathway that I'm not opposed to, by the way, trying to find a pathway to ease out of the tax on businesses, the
franchise
margins tax.
Yeah, margins tax.
Yeah.
But that would seem to give you one fewer tool.
Well, we don't have a lot of tools, you're right. But a growing economy is what's really critical. And as the state grows, I guess we'll have to examine whether what we're doing is working. I don't think, as a fiscal conservative, I'm not looking for a way to flood the state's treasury with a lot more revenue. But we have to manage the revenue we have better. And I think that's a big exercise that we're going through right now with our Appropriations Committee. One of the things that I think will result in something very positive for us is Representative Capriglione's effort to take a look at contracting in the state and try to find efficiencies there. First thing we need to do is make sure we're spending the dollars we have wisely and efficiently. An awful lot of our money goes to state contract to private vendors, and we believe that there are substantial savings available there. So before we start looking at ways to restructure all the tools and new tax vehicles and all this stuff, let's spend the revenue we have under the system we have better, more efficiently, and see if we can do well in the limited government state of Texas that I grew up in and that I think is going to be in place for the foreseeable future.
So that's got to be, how much consensus do you think there is on that? Because I mean, part of the noise I'm sensing in the system is, and you said so yourself, that there's attention being paid to things that aren't really about that. Did I hear that?
Well, I'm sorry.
Well, that there are other, that there's only so much time in the session and so much time in the agenda, so much space on the agenda, and yet we're talking about other things.
Well, I think there's the noise and the attention is not always on where the hard work's being done. And I think if you look deeply into the work of the Appropriations Committee and the commitment, the focus that those people have, that those members have, I think you'd find that they're going to do some really good work, and they are focused on bread and butter issues. Same thing with education, but they may not be having the most press conferences or getting the most attention.
Okay. Another question from the audience? Lindsay?
Given that the Senate has, it seems, pushed controversial legislation earlier this session than usual, what are you sensing from the House? Has fatigue set in, or are things just business as usual?
I think it's pretty much business as usual. We have 140 days to do our work. The House as an institution is designed to not spring into action on day one. I mean, we don't even elect the presiding officer until we get there, and then it's a pretty unwieldy process with 150 members and dozens of committees that have to be organized and get them up and running and indoctrinated into a new session. So, and plus the constitutional fact that bills can't come to the floor for the first 60 days. So the rhythm feels pretty normal to me in the House. The Senate does its thing and the House does ours, and then we have to meet up where we meet up at the end and do what we can do. And I'm pretty confident that we'll have a good session. The one kind of overhang this time that we did not have 2 years ago is a significant budget shortfall, and that requires a lot of focus, and it's not easy to deal with.
And you've been through it before, really, even when
I've
it's
been through a lot
right?
worse than this. Yeah, and I went through that session in 2011 where we actually cut spending in public education, which is about the last place you want to cut, but we did it, and I don't want to have to do that again.
And it took some catch up for a while.
It sure did, yeah, and I don't want to do that again. So we're going to have some thoughtful tools out there, and I think at the end of the day, we're going to have a good agreement. We're going to have a thoughtful budget that funds the priorities that we've been working on.
Well, then we'll end on a note of optimism.
Good.
Mr. Speaker, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again to the Speaker and to our studio and internet audience. Keep an eye out for the video for this interview and more resources on the Texas Politics website, and have a good weekend.